So I know there's a lot of different ways to do this, but we're just going to focus on the grids, distances, and size and area. Basically, whatever we show here is something you can apply to all those other kind of graphics. And then we'll also do a separate one for the combined parameters. So this one's obviously significantly different. So we'll also go over how to do this, because now we're looking at three-dimensional objects, color, essentially a rastered image with a combination of vector graphics. So this is where we can start to kind of get a little bit more robust in our representation beyond just what we can see in Grasshopper and Rhino. So let's switch back over to this one. So like I said, there's what you see kind of at face value with these scripts, but then being able to show it a little bit more dynamically is also important with this exercise. So a lot of it, again, is going to require layer management, just organizing things. What's great about this is that we should be able to export this directly to Illustrator, and if you put things on the correct layer, they'll actually bring those layers into Illustrator as well. So it's, again, one of those things where if you put in the effort of organizing your files and going through the proper workflow, it's actually pretty efficient in many cases. So that's something we'll show today. For things like the grids and coordinates and even the distances, you have to be aware too that these are using points, right? So if I look at, for example, this one, it's a bunch of random points. These don't actually have any geometry associated to it. So even if you were to bake these points into Rhino, those aren't going to transfer over to Illustrator because Illustrator doesn't understand points, right? They have like no geometry associated to it. So you do have to do a little bit of additional, I guess, geometry to this. And I mean, there's a lot of different ways we can start to do that. And we'll show it for both of these because in order to show coordinates and grids and distances, it's good to understand where those points are that are creating these elements. So something we can do, again, with this grid, I'm just showing something a little bit more interesting to kind of reinforce some of the representation from this. But you can see there's the cells themselves that are creating this grid, and then there's actually points as part of that. So these are the center points of that. So you could do it like that, but there's really no like direct correlation between them. It's something that might be important to show though still. But we might also want to show how that grid itself is being assembled beyond just those curves. So what we can also do is go to curves, analysis, and look at the control points of these cells. So if I drag that in now, and now I'll start to have points at all those corners too. But like I said, we can see where that grid of points are, but in terms of being able to show that and represent it, it's not going to translate because they're just points. So this is where you can start to get a little more creative to show like, okay, what am I going to do to represent those points? We can keep it simple and just use a circle to do that. This is something I typically do with two-dimensional graphics. I can just, so these are the points, I just drag that into there, and you can see it just gives these much too large circles, so I can create a number slider to reduce that. And these will essentially represent that grid, right? So this is something we can actually start to see in Illustrator. And you could do something similar to that as well. I'm just gonna copy and paste that and even use these points as well. We might not want to show the same size because, again, thinking about graphic principles, having hierarchy is also important. So you have to kind of decide, like, what's the more important grid system? Is it the center of these hexagons? Is it the actual corners? That's really kind of to your discretion. But you can start to 0.256, that's a very specific radius, but we can start to do something like that. You can even start to decide, maybe I just want a totally different type of geometry. So you could even do something like a rectangle, I suppose, right? Again, you'll have to adjust all these values. But maybe that's another way you start to represent. So start to think about, like, how are you going to represent points on a grid, because those points aren't going to, again, translate into Illustrator. I don't want to deal with that, so I'll just stick with this guy. And like I said, you can do the same thing then with distances. You can get even a little more creative with this, depending on where maybe some of these points are. You can see that we've kind of got this grouping of 3 main points that are associated with all these random set of points, right? We could even go as far as maybe we create a circle where this is kind of attracting all these, and maybe it's representative of the number of points that's collected with it, right? So if I were to, let's turn this on real quick. So if I were to maybe move one, so we can see a little bit more of that kind of discrepancy. So we can see that this one clearly has a lot more points connected to it than this one. We could actually start to count those number of points and say, like, okay, maybe if this only has 10, it's got a much smaller circle than something that has something like 30 points. So again, it's a way to kind of understand that grouping beyond just the composition itself, right? Like, the whole point of showing information is to bring clarity to that without it being too complex. So introducing kind of very similar, very simple, very defined other ways to represent that information can make it that much more tangible or decipherable. And what's good about it is that it can actually count this. So if there's 3 items, it's going to create an index between 0 and 2. So if there's 3 objects, it goes from 0 to 2. If there's 5, it goes from 0 to 4. Essentially just starts at 0 and just adds to those groups. And in order to figure that out, I'll probably do the more complicated way. I'm sure there's a simpler way to do it. But if I go to Math, Operations, Equality, I can look at these indexes and say, okay, find all the ones that are equal to 0. And it's going to give me a true and false output, which is saying if it's equal to 0, it's true. If it's not equal to 0, it's false. It's an interesting way, and we'll get into more about how this part works. But for now, it'll just serve the purpose of helping us count this. And it really doesn't matter what we're going to plug into this list. I can just say index, and we can see that this one, so the 0 one, has 51 points associated with it. If I were to then do that for all of these values, so Control C, Control V, now I can do 1, and then 2. So now I can see, okay, there's 71 associated with that one, 28 associated with that one, and 51 associated with that one. So again, we can use these number values to create a circle that's represented to that. And actually, let's, instead of using the index, let's use points. So that way it should show where that actual point is, right? So there's this one. So this is that one that has a total of 51 points. So in order to actually give that a number, it's just counting it. Like, you can see that it shows 51, but we can't really use that to create geometry. So we can just create a circle. Again, we'll use this center point, and again, we want to use the number of points in that list to associate with its radius. So in order to do that, we go to Sets, List Length. So this will actually count it for us and just give us a whole number, so 51. If I put this 51 into here, again, it's going to create a circle with a radius of 51 or 102 foot diameter, which is going to go way off the screen. So you'll see as soon as I plug that in, it doesn't really help us, right? So maybe we give it a small fraction of that. So maybe it's, I don't know, let's see what happens if it's a tenth of that. So instead of going through this process of adding a bunch of other components, we can add expressions to these things too. So instead of it being 51, maybe I want it to be 5.1. So I can right click on this input, go to expression, and do a little algebra, which I'm sure you all are thrilled to have reintroduced to you. So in order to give it an expression, I do x. So again, algebraic, whatever gets plugged in, you say is x. So x is essentially the input. In this case, 51. I'm going to take multiply 0.1 or 10% or 1/10. And now it gives me a radius of 5.1. Still a little big, so let's do a fifth or a 20th, so 0.05. All right, so that's a little bit more tangible. I guess we can just do 100th, so 0.01. So that's a little bit better. And I don't have to go through that process of doing it for all these. I can just do copy and paste, plug it into this. So I can see this one's got a much smaller one. Let's just turn all this off too. So it's amazing how complex these can get just to make it for representation, but it is what it is. And then I can just go. So now I've got that circle that represents that. Right, and again, what's good about this, if I decide that I want to move any of these points around, its circle is automatically going to start to get larger based off of those values. So you can see everything's kind of adjusting to this. And again, that's why we do things like it this way, so that no matter what we do to it, those things start to change. All right, so it's not a huge difference, but you do see how the circle's changing size as it attracts more points. Let's try to get it somewhere in the middle. Okay, so something like that. And then for this one, so this one's looking at size and area. They're kind of all these weird shapes, right? So what we would want to do is give some type of text just to tell us what that area is. And so I've got the cells there. I can do area. It'll give us a center point where we can put that text, but then it gives us that area value. And so all we have to do is go to display, text tag 3D. The reason I'm doing it this way is because now I can control the size of the text. So it's looking for the location, which is going to be our center point. The text to display, that's the area. You can see it just completely oversizes them. And so we can give it something a little bit more easy to understand. So now that's a little bit better. We can read that much more clearly. We can even give them color, which I'm not going to worry about because I can always do that in Illustrator. And then justification. I'm just going to do middle center. And then I can turn off the points. And this is something interesting too. And this is why we're doing this one as an example, because even though the text is really a display object, you can still bake that into Rhino and edit it in Illustrator, but it's a little tricky. You just have to be aware of some of the windows that pop up in Illustrator to ask you how you want to edit the text, because it's going to look kind of weird if you don't do it correctly. So here's the 3 things that we want to export into Illustrator. Let's do one more thing. I'm just going to, again, make this one a little bit more complex and say that at the endpoints that these, or I can look at these random set of points and just give them a circle as well. And I can probably just be consistent by using the same size. So that, again, I know what's kind of being attracted by it. I mean, you can get even crazier with this and say, like, make that size of these circles correspond with, like, the length of this line. Like, that's where you start to really kind of push that idea, but it's certainly something that can be done and was discussed in some of those other videos when we're starting to adjust and remap values. So, okay, I think we've got this all set up. So like I said, this is where it gets important to organize things. So in Rhino, you might want to just first start off by creating separate layers. So we'll call this one grid. This layer will be called distance. This layer will be called area. So this way, when I bring it into Illustrator, I can just turn layers on and off without having to worry about messing up any of these other objects. And you can go even further of going and creating sublayers. So if I create this new sublayer, I can say, okay, this is hex point, hex center, right? So I've got this one will be like the actual curve itself. The hex points will be these ones on the edges, and this, like, you can get that kind of organized with it all. It's really kind of up to you what makes life easier for you. I'll keep it simple in this case, or in other words, lazy. But okay, so I think we've got everything set up with our layers. So now you want to start to actually put this stuff from Grasshopper into Rhino. So I can, again, I can just highlight these to see which ones I'm looking at. So here's the circles around that. So I can right click, say bake, choose that layer. So hex points, here's the bake, hex center, then here's the hex grid, so bake, hex. And then if I want to actually see what that looks like, I can just select all that. I'll hit spacebar and just disable the preview. And now you can see that these are actually in Rhino now. And like, again, you can see that these all have the same color. So if I want to see it a little bit better, I can just start to assign them their different colors. Right, and what's good about this too is whatever that layer color is going to also translate into Illustrator, which could be a good way of just kind of, again, organizing all this. So I'm not going to be as diligent with the next one and having all those layers. I'm just going to bake them all into the same layer. So I've got this one, bake, distance, bake, distance. Then I've got these three, bake, distance, bake, distance, bake, distance. All right, so again, I'll just turn off all of this. You can see that since they're all just on this distance, which is purple, everything's purple. So let's do this final one. So Again, I got the Voronoi curve, so bake into area. And again, even though it's just a display component, that's what it means when you have this kind of jagged edge on the side, is that you can't really pull anything from that, like out. It's just essentially an endpoint. I can just still say bake and do area. Let's turn it off, and you can see that it's still actually there, but we have to do one more thing in order to have it. Well, I'll double check. We might be able to get away with it without having to do anything else. So there's that. Let me just try it. Sometimes, I think it's the other text tag where if you explode it, it helps, but that just creates an actual curve itself. So if you do decide to explode these, then they become just curve objects. They're no longer text. So if you ever need to edit them, you can see if I want to say, you know what, I don't want it to be 2 decimals, I can still edit it that way, or add it or round it up. So it's still actually text. If you explode it, then it becomes a curve, which then you can't really edit to. So just be mindful of that. The next thing to do with this is that, again, just for clarity, don't have it like at an angle or anything in your workshop. You actually want to be in the top view. So there's a couple of ways. Usually by default, you have a top view that you can go to. Now you can just select and highlight everything. So even the bounding box and the labels underneath, go to File, Export Selected, and let's just put it on the desktop for now. And so make sure when you're saving it or exporting it, that you select it as an Illustrator, so Adobe Illustrator. File name, I'm just going to call it grid distance area. And just go ahead and hit save. Cancel, please. Oh, because I guess I didn't actually put it on the, there we go. Then you get this export. You could just probably in this case do a snapshot of the current view. We don't have to worry about preserving the scale in this case. Color mode, always do it in RGB. And don't worry about an export boundary. So you can pretty much keep it simple like that. Hit OK. And now I can just go to Illustrator. In this case, again, the deliverables are to put these on an 8.5 by 11, rescale that bounding box to be 6 inches. So let's go ahead and go to File, Open, Desktop. Here's our Illustrator file. So this is the thing you need to be aware of with, because I have text that I'm bringing in, the way Rhino creates text versus the way Illustrator understands text are a little bit different. So anytime you start to import text from Rhino into Illustrator, you're going to get this window prompt. And usually, like, Illustrator's pretty smart, and whatever it highlights, it's like, yeah, that's probably what I want to do, right? So it says, like, oh, do you want to update this legacy text or these other things? If you just think, yeah, that's what I want to do. Don't do that. Actually, just hit update. If you hit OK, I'll show you what happens. So with this text, it actually creates this weird kind of bounding box around it. And then you have to, I don't even know if you can eventually edit it. It's just a real pain in the butt. So I'm just going to go ahead and reopen that and show you just what the difference is. So again, hit update. And now you'll find when you select that text, it's an actual text line in Illustrator. So just remember to hit update and not hit OK. All right, so now we've got our files. Like I said, it's really smart in bringing in all these layers. So you can see here's all my layers in Illustrator. I can even look at it doesn't keep those sublayers like it is in Rhino, but I still have those ones separate. So there's the grid center point, the grid point, and the grid itself. So I want to bring these objects into this one where I've already got it set up to 8.5 by 11s. If you ever want to essentially copy and paste vector geometry from one file to another and maintain these layers, because you can see this one's just got the default layer 1. In order to actually bring in those layers as well, if you click on this button here, make sure that this is selected, paste remembers layers. If that's not selected, and I just do Control C and Control V, now I've lost all that work and it just puts it all on the single layer, which is always a major pain. So I'm going to again click on that, paste remembers layers. And now when I paste it into here, I brought in all my layers, which just makes life so much simpler. So again, these all need to be on their own separate page. So I'm just going to kind of move them over. And like I said, so these have to be roughly, or not roughly, they have to be 6-inch squares. We can see that this one's a little bit, goes beyond this grid. So what I'm going to do is actually select everything, hold Shift to deselect that bounding box, and I'm just going to scale it so that they're all kind of within that bounding box. So that way it just, again, kind of makes the scaling a little bit easier. Okay, so now what I can do is if I select this, I should get this button up here that says Transform. And what I want to do is change the width and height to 6 inches. And I can even just keep it scaled and just hit 6. And now I've got a nice 6-inch box. You can decide where you want to put it. It could be in the center, it could be offset a little bit. It's really kind of up to you. Obviously you want to resize this text. So I'm gonna, instead of that being 5.7, let's make it something like 18. I'll even go as far as using another font style. This is where, again, you kind of get to decide on that. So again, none of this has associated line weight, so you have to start to decide on how you want to do that. So make those kind of decisions. Like, what do you think is probably the priority of this graphic? Is it the bounding box? Is that the most important thing to show? Probably not, right? Like, it's helping frame the composition. So what do you think is probably the most important thing? Sure, I would say definitely either like a combination of the center point or even these curves themselves too, right? The orange hexagon is really just kind of supplemental to understand the grid a little bit better. So make those kind of decisions, right? So if you didn't organize this by layers, so let's just show what might happen if these aren't on the same layer. I'm just gonna go ahead and put them all on the same thing, so because I can show you another way to how to kind of organize it if you have different colors, right? So everything's on that same layer now. So that might be a pain, right? It's like, oh, how do I like select just these guys, right? In Illustrator, you've got these cool feature where you can select by certain properties. So if I say select by stroke color, it'll just select all those hexagons for me. They're obviously on top of those other ones too, which I don't want. So I can right click, say arrange, send to back. And this is where maybe I start to play with the colors. So maybe that has kind of like a nice gray tone. It's much thinner, right? So again, if I want to deselect just to see what that looks like, I can, and then again, I'll just do the select similar objects and I'll select all those again. Again, even I could take it a little bit further and make them dashed lines instead of solid. So I can go to my stroke properties here, say dashed, and instead of them actually being dashed, I can make them dots. So in order to make them dots, I can give them a 0 dash. And usually what I like to do, I'll increase the weight a little bit more. And then I'll make the gap usually something like twice the size of the weight, so something like 1.5. Let's see what that looks like. Yeah, that looks pretty good. Make sure that the caps are rounded in order to get that. If it's square, it's just going to look like these kind of things. Maybe that's what you want. I like to just kind of keep them circles. So now I have that to kind of give that suggested grid. This is again where you can start to give more hierarchy. So I'll again select these by those similar features. These just are strokes right now, so they're actually just really thick curves. So if I shrink them, right, they're actually hollow. But if I want them to be solid, I can just hit Shift X and now they're solid objects. And this is where you can again start to kind of give some type of associated color to them. And then again, maybe if those are the more important pieces, I can then select these, select all the similar, hit Shift X. This is something to be aware of. Even though they were truly circles in Rhino, they're kind of these weird kind of rounded squares. That's just something that doesn't translate as well. And I'm sure if you really kind of dive in, you could find the resolution to that, but for now it's okay for this. Maybe that was my intention the whole time, I don't know. So for this, I'm gonna just eyedrop these colors to get the same thing, but again, I don't want there to be conflicting colors, so I can go to my color guide and give a different kind of spectrum. So maybe these are more kind of muted, or maybe it's a little bit lighter. So it's still kind of within that color range, but slightly different, right? Then again, I've got those very bold bounding box, which I really don't care for, so go to my swatches, give it a really faint gray, oops, not to fill. Then make it also something like 0.25. Maybe it's a little bolder. Maybe like 0.5, right? So that starts to give us a nice kind of clear idea. And so the next thing is just, again, part of this exercise is to be consistent, right? This is why I've got them all in the same files, because now I can use the advantage of the eyedropper tool. So again, I'll shift this over, I'll select all of this, transform, change it to all 6 inches, right? And again, even though it's not on the same layer, or they're all on the same layer, I can easily just start to eyedrop. So here's my bounding box, eyedrop for this one. Again, I'll do the same thing, maybe these lines. This might actually be a little tricky. Because these are pretty much the same type of, I think, thickness too. Oh boy. So yeah, organize your layers better, right? Else you're gonna run into this issue where I'm like, oh yeah, just select the similar properties, and it's gonna select both of those. So I don't have an easy workaround for that. So yeah, it's just gonna require you, if you want, to just kind of go through that process. I mean, let's give it a shot. Let's see if we can get as close as possible. So if I eyedrop it to be something kind of like that same hexagon, what I can do is I can try to like just select these areas that are kind of like not touching any of those circles, create a new layer and drop those behind it, turn it off. All right, so I can kind of just find that area where the majority are not going to intersect with the circles themselves. If I hold shift, I can just kind of continuously drag and select them, so. So that actually wasn't too bad for one of them. Right, so now I'm just left with those circles. Oh man, I have to do it for all these, aren't I?
What if you chose a circle? Like no circle? What if you like mark no circle? That's what I would say.
Yeah. That's why I never say I'm the smartest person in the room. So let's put these on a separate layer, right? I'll turn it off so I don't have to worry about selecting it again. That might have just gotten you an A. Yes. Brainstorming, problem solving. That's why we're in school, right? Whew, that saved me a good 10 minutes of recording time, right? All right, so now I can put this guy into the other one, which I think I put them in different layers now. Shoot.
No, what Alex says is select a circle, then put select similar.
It will. They're all the same type of appearance, so I actually you would think it's that smart, but it's really not. Like you could be like, oh, it's a closed curve, right? But so this one. So this is why we also name things. So those all need to go into that one. So let's just keep this one there for now. Okay, so I think we're okay now. Disaster averted. Okay, so there we go. This will make life easier. So I'll just select again these. Again, probably one of the more important things. Maybe these are actually more of the bold colors. Let's try it. All right, so there's that one. There's these ones, which could look like this. And now I've got these ones, right? So this is what we're talking about of kind of keeping it graphically consistent. So that using color scheme, text, all that fun stuff. Okay. Do I need to do it for this third one, or you guys want to go to the 3D object? Okay, everyone kind of good? You just take advantage of eyedropper, text. Like if you're really good, you would even do like for all those kind of graphics that aren't the 3D one, just put them all in the same exact file. That way you can just eyedrop stuff and keep it as consistent as possible, because that is what part of the grading is, that graphics are consistent. Okay?
I don't want to speak for all of us, but I think most of us have a good amount of experience in Illustrator. But Grasshopper is definitely new for
Gotcha.
at least me.
Okay, right. I'm certainly aware of that. I've seen your guys' work, so like I said, I don't want to spend too much time, but I do want to make sure everyone just kind of understands the workflow at least, and everyone's kind of as consistent as possible with that. So let's, jump into the fun piece, right? This bad boy. Oops. So there's a couple ways to do this, again, to kind of make it as dynamic as possible, so to speak. There's the raster damage itself. Like I said, I kind of played around with this color scheme to give different opacities and transparency. So there's kind of this cyan blue that's really transparent. Then I also added another purple to this that's slightly transparent. It's Alpha channel's a little bit better. And then there's a solid white, and I can always kind of adjust it however I want to get to that. But the idea is, at least for me, it's doing it the way I want it to, where it seems like there's areas where it's just like a solid cube, but then things start to fragment apart. Like I said, this is where you can start to, again, do different iterations of this as well. So when I say in the exercise to explore different options or different iterations of this, this is where it's about moving these points around to shift the overall kind of appearance of it. It could be changing of the colors. So you could do one where it's kind of like this. What if we were to, instead of use a white color, we use black, and then actually change the display of our Rhino space to black as well, and it actually looks like it blends straight into it, which could be kind of interesting, right? Maybe you don't want that to be like solid black, kind of erasing that. You can even give that black a slight transparency, so you can kind of start to see a little bit through it. Right, so there's all sorts of kind of interesting ways that you can start to have fun with how this reads transparent and kind of utilize the display settings of this. So that's another way of kind of altering it. So let's get back to white, solid, okay. So part of it is really just kind of have fun with this and just come up with interesting ways of manipulating things. So, okay. Again, like you don't have to worry about for this one showing this bounding box and label because it's going to be kind of weird, so I'm just going to hide it for now. Okay, so like I said, there's the rastered image itself. And then there's still a couple other things we might want to add to this. Like maybe we still want to show some of the curves or the vector of it. So I'm going to go ahead and kind of go back to here. Again, I can't actually bake this. So if I were to right click, kind of like the text, you would think, if I bake this, say layer 1 for now, turn it off, nothing's there. So it can actually bake these color displays, which is unfortunate, but that's okay. What we want to do actually in Rhino is set up some scenes, because I think it also says to show it three different ways. So it's also important to kind of set up views to kind of make sure everything begins to match as well. So again, this is kind of bothering me with this wall here, so I'm going to move this piece over a little bit. Yeah, so maybe it looks something like that. Okay, so what you want to do in order to kind of save these scenes, have you guys done that before where you save a scene? Okay, so this is any time when you start to get into the rendering aspect. So I'm going to right click, set view, go to named views. And then I'm just going to hit the save as, and we'll say it's cubes 1. And what's good about it is I can start to now move around, change things. If I ever want to go back to that, I can just double click on here and it'll bring me right back to that scene. So like I said, this is where you want to kind of look at different perspectives of this. It's like, oh, this one looks cool looking at it from below. So again, I'll do save as, cubes 2. And then maybe you could also look at it with something maybe straight down. Save as, cubes 3. So first kind of go through that process of just setting up where do you want those views to be at. The next thing we can do is, even though we can't physically bake that, we can start to kind of go back further into this Rhino file. So the box themselves, those are things we can bake. And maybe we want to kind of show the framing of these a little bit. So I'm going to go ahead and bake these onto layer 2 for now. turn off preview, and it's set to wireframe, so we'll just change it to shaded. So it's just going to kind of create the actual objects themselves, right? So again, this is why we do the saved views, because the next thing, so if I want to go to here, in order to actually transfer this into curves, we'll use the make 2D command. Have you guys used that before? So it's the best way to kind of get 3D graphics or objects into a Illustrator line work format. So, and this is why we want to save views. So that way I'll have a rastered, rendered image, I'll have the make 2D image, I don't have to worry about trying to get everything lined up well. So I'm going to select all that. Oops. Make 2D. And this is where you can start to adjust some of the settings. So something that might be good to do is actually show hidden lines. So there's a lot of overlapping of geometry. So you could have the ones that are actually in the foreground and some that are in the background, and maybe the ones in the background or the hidden lines are dashed to kind of give that idea of transparency. So for some reason, it just turns that off, or no, it does have them. So visible lines, hidden lines. You really don't have to worry about tangent edges in this case. So I'm just going to hit OK. And now I've got this view. And I'm just going to move it so that the next thing I do won't overlap. So again, layers, you'll see that there's the hidden lines versus the solid lines, right? So that's pretty much what it would look like. And then if you were to take those hidden lines and make them dashed, it'll give it a sense of transparency, which could be cool. The next thing you could also do for this is that, again, knowing with line drawings, sense of hierarchy and line weight, sometimes it's good to kind of show the profile line, so everything that's kind of around a solid background. So instead of having to do that manually, you can actually do that in Illustrator or in Rhino as well. So I'm going to select that object again, go to my view. Instead of using the make 2D, I'm going to go to curve, curve from objects, and even though these are surfaces or B-reps, if you use the mesh outline, so it's not just for meshes, it can be for all of these. If I do this, it'll create, it's kind of weird where it gets set up, and I hopefully it works. It kind of matches whatever that view is, so it's kind of weird and skewed, but let me go back to this. Oops, I moved it, so that's why. If I turn off that purple layer, you'll see that it's creating this outline of the actual object. But as soon as you move again, like it's kind of like, it projects it onto whatever that view is, which is kind of weird, but it is what it is. But now I've got my outline. So now we can start to have a little bit more fun with this in Illustrator. So I think those are the three kind of outputs or exports you want to get from Rhino. There's the rendering itself, there's the curves from the make 2D object, and then there's even this mesh silhouette.
So that silhouette you put on the different layers will be.
Yep, exactly. So you can give that a kind of a bolder line weight. So yeah, let's start to do that. So I'm going to select this along with these kind of interstitial parts. Oops. Oh. Edit. What's that? Saved you some time?
Yeah, I was just saying, that would have saved me like 3 hours last semester, because I traced one of the drawings.
Now you never will again.
Yeah, no, I will not.
Okay. So here's the thing I mentioned earlier that you don't have to worry about, but for this case, because again, this is kind of set to a projection and a view, what I want to do, so again, I'm going to do File, Export Selected, do it as an Illustrator file, desktop, I'm going to say cube profile. And this is where you do want to make sure that the export viewport boundary is selected, because it is going to create a bounding box around your viewport, and that's what you're going to use to match everything else up. So I'll hit OK, and you'll see later what that does, because you can see that this creates that bounding box too. This is essentially your reference or datum point to match everything. The rendering is going to come out with the same resolution. So that's what's going to be key to kind of make sure everything's matching. So now I'll, again, go ahead and select all of this. Make sure even though it creates it in a top view, make sure you actually go to your top view. And now you can just do export. So we can do cube curves. This, again, like you already have that viewport boundary, so you can deselect that, hit OK. And then the last thing you want to do is you can turn off all this extra stuff and go back to your object itself. Go to rendered. I guess it doesn't really matter. Let's actually turn that off because I don't actually need it. I just need it displayed here. So even though it's not physically there, you can still render this straight from Grasshopper, which is just a complete lifesaver, because you can go through all the process of like baking color and all these other things into Rhino, but you can just render it like it is. So if you go to View, Capture to File, it essentially creates a rendered image. And because I have transparency on this, I actually want to export it as a PNG. PNG will actually maintain the transparency of objects versus a JPEG is going to flatten it all and just give it a white background. So PNG will actually keep a transparent background if that's selected. So let's do cube render. All right, so the transparent background for supported layers, if you select that, it should work. We'll see. Okay, so you've got all your elements. Now I can go to this. Again, create a new 8.5 by 11. And this is where I can start to match everything. So I'm going to go to File, Open. I'm just going to, so these two. So like I said, these are the bounding boxes, what's going to make sure everything matches. And then I'm going to first bring in that rendered image. So File, Place, where is that? Cube Render, right? So I'm just going to click and drag to kind of be within these bounds for now. And you can see, oh, that looks weird. So be aware of that. Sometimes the colors get a little bit weird. It's probably because that alpha channel is so high, but so you might want to have less transparency to that, but it'll still look okay. So I'll go ahead and bring in this layer. So again, I'll just copy. It's got all those layers. So it's got the hidden and the visible. Control C, Control V. This is again where I can start to make sure everything matches. So it'll usually snap to the edges of that image. And now it's matching nicely. So again, I've got the hidden. The hidden I'll probably want to put it behind. Can make sure that this has its own style. So it's still probably kind of faint. So I don't want it to distort too much. Let's actually do it even more. So it's just kind of subtle, right? And then I can even do the hidden ones. And if I'm really good about it, I'll go to this and be like, yeah, I kind of want them to look like this. So I'll just copy, paste, and now I can just select my hidden lines, eyedrop this. It starts to get a little messy, right? So we can even adjust that transparency, the opacity of it, to like 20%, maybe it's even thinner. So now we can start to get that kind of grid behind it too, which starts to kind of look interesting. And then I don't need this one anymore. Now I can go to this cube profile, Control C, Control V. Snap to it. Ugh. Now you can get it close enough, this manually. So now I've got that piece. All right, and now let's get rid of this one. Now I'll do it. Again, I don't want it to be too crazy looking, but there we go. So now we have a nice kind of bold profile of it, all the other line work. That's what we want to start to kind of see with that. And that's just a matter of 3 kind of exports. Okay. So this video is just so that